The golden light of torches flickered across the marble halls of Topkapi Palace, glinting off walls adorned with calligraphy and tiles of deep blue. Beneath the domes of Istanbul, where the muezzin's call to prayer echoed over the Bosphorus, a young princess prepared for her wedding night. To the outside world, she was the very image of power and privilege. Draped in silks woven with threads of gold, her neck heavy with pearls, her forehead pressed with jewels so rare that even merchants of Venice whispered their names with awe. Servants bowed low as she passed, eunuchs cleared her path, and courtiers treated her presence as if the empire itself had walked into the room. Yet beneath all the ceremony, beneath the layers of perfume and brocade, there was no celebration in her heart. There was only fear. Because in the Ottoman world, the wedding night of a princess was not a night of intimacy or romance. It was a ritual of politics, a moment when the body of a royal woman became an offering, not to love but to power. This was the contradiction at the heart of Ottoman royalty. The daughters of sultans were born into unimaginable privilege, yet when it came to the most personal moments of their lives, they were stripped of choice. A princess could wield influence in the court, she could be celebrated in poetry, her very name could seal alliances between empires, but she could not decide whom she would marry, and she could not escape the looming dread of the wedding chamber. These women stood at the crossroads of love and empire, but the empire always won. Their first nights as brides were nights of silence, submission, and terror. Every step toward the bridal chamber was a step deeper into a future dictated not by affection, but by strategy. To understand why, one must enter the world of the Ottoman court, a world both glittering and suffocating. At its heart stood the Sultan, the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth, master of millions of subjects across 3 continents. His will was absolute, and his family lived under the shadow of that will. The palace was not merely a residence but a machine of power. Its harems, its courtyards, its chambers were designed not just for luxury but for control. Women of the dynasty lived in a gilded cage, every movement watched, every alliance calculated. For the Sultan, daughters were not simply children to be cherished. They were instruments, keys to unlock loyalty from ambitious pashas, bridges to tie rival families to the throne, pawns in the chessboard of empire. And so, when a princess came of age, her fate was sealed not by her heart but by the state. These marriages were rarely gentle unions. They were contracts inked not in letters but in flesh and blood. A princess might be handed to a man twice her age, a man she had barely spoken to, a man whose loyalty the Sultan wished to bind with chains stronger than oaths. The wedding bed was the final seal of that contract. For the bride, it was the moment her body became proof of political alliance. For the groom, it was both an honor and a dangerous responsibility. To fail in loyalty afterward was not only betrayal of the throne but betrayal of the Sultan's bloodline itself. And for the princess, the horror was knowing that her worth as a wife was not measured in affection but in obedience, in the ability to survive the suffocating role imposed upon her. From the outside, poets and chroniclers painted these weddings as spectacles of splendor. They described caravans of gifts winding through the streets of Istanbul, feasts laid out with roasted lamb and honeyed sweets, music echoing through the courtyards while fireworks lit the skies above the palace. But hidden behind the smoke of celebration was the quiet dread of the bride. No one sang of her tears. No one recorded the pounding of her heart as she crossed the threshold of the bridal chamber. To the empire, she was a symbol of unity. To herself, she was often little more than a prisoner cloaked in jewels. And so the question lingers, haunting across the centuries: how could women so close to the throne, women who bore the title of sultana, find themselves powerless at the very moment most personal to them? The answer lies not only in the politics of marriage but in the very fabric of the Ottoman dynasty. For while the empire built its strength on armies and conquest, it was maintained in the bedroom, in the alliances sealed by royal women who were denied the right to choose their own destiny. Their wedding nights were not beginnings of love stories. They were acts of submission to a system where empire demanded their bodies, their silence, and their fear. Most people never hear these darker truths of royal life. The glittering palaces, the jeweled crowns, the endless feasts, they all hide stories that were meant to stay buried. Behind every empire's glory lies a silence carefully kept, a silence that swallows the pain of those who could never speak for themselves. Don't let their voices vanish again. Subscribe now and help bring back the forgotten past they wanted us to forget. Life inside the Ottoman palace was a world of contradictions. The architecture itself was designed to awe: vast courtyards, towering gates, domes gilded with gold, and fountains that whispered through marble gardens. The harem, often sensationalized by foreign travelers, was not the exotic playground they imagined but a place of discipline, order, and politics. Here, the sultan's daughters grew up under the careful watch of attendants, eunuchs, and senior women of the court. They were taught poetry, embroidery, etiquette, and religious devotion, yet from an early age they also learned another lesson: their lives did not belong to them. Every gift of silk, every jewel, every guarded privilege was a reminder that they were not free women but vessels of the dynasty. When the time for marriage approached, the palace moved like a carefully wound clock. Rituals unfolded with precision. Servants prepared dowries so immense they dazzled even seasoned governors. Chests of silk garments, gold-threaded carpets, jeweled ornaments, and silverware heavy enough to crush a table. Musicians rehearsed the songs to accompany the bridal procession. Envoys whispered in corridors, discussing which provincial governor, which vizier, or which military commander would receive the honor and the burden of wedding a princess. None of this was her choice. She might never have seen the man she was to marry until the day of her wedding. For her, the glittering rituals were little more than chains disguised as ceremony. The harem itself became a hive of tense activity. Older women counseled the bride-to-be, reminding her of her duty, her responsibility to the dynasty, and her obligation to preserve honor. Every gesture, every word, every step into her new life would be scrutinized, not just by her husband but by the empire itself. Behind closed doors, whispers followed her. Speculation about where she would be sent, how her marriage might tilt the balance of power, and whether she would become a source of influence, or a forgotten figure banished to a distant province. The air was thick with expectation, yet heavy with fear. And then came the darkest reality. These marriages were never about companionship or affection. The Sultan gave his daughters not to men who loved them, but to men he wished to bind with loyalty. A loyal general might be rewarded with a princess. A wavering governor might be secured through such a union. To the empire it was a strategy. To the princess it was surrender. Her first wedding night was not a step into romance but a test of politics. She entered the chamber not as a bride, but as proof, a living contract between throne and subject. What happens when a wedding bed isn't about love, but about empire, alliances, and control? What happens when the man beside you is not a partner, but a symbol of your father's power over the provinces? For the princess, intimacy was never truly private. Her ability to bear children, her behavior, her very presence in the marriage would be reported back to the palace. Success was measured in loyalty secured and heirs produced. Failure could mean disgrace, dismissal, or isolation in a place far removed from the splendor of Istanbul. Even the celebration itself carried undertones of fear. The bridal procession that led her out of the palace, surrounded by guards, musicians, and courtiers, was both a spectacle and a farewell. Crowds might cheer, but she knew that each step took her further from the safety of her childhood and deeper into the uncertainty of a new world. For some, marriage led to influence, giving them a role in provincial politics or court intrigue. For others, it was exile in velvet robes, their voices drowned in silence, their lives spent fulfilling duties they had never chosen. This tension defined the lives of Ottoman princesses. Their gilded cages sparkled with jewels, but the bars were unyielding. They belonged to an empire that used them as weapons, rewards, and seals of loyalty. And though history remembers the sultans who conquered cities and commanded armies, it often forgets the women whose nights were conquered not by war, but by duty. Their fear was not of battlefields or sieges, but of the locked doors of a bridal chamber, and the knowledge that love had no place in their fate. The most terrifying moment for an Ottoman princess did not come during the feasts or ceremonies that marked her wedding day. It came in the silence that followed, when the music faded, the guests departed, and the palace doors closed. What awaited her in that chamber was not the gentle promise of a new life, but a test. Consummation was not seen as an act of intimacy, nor as a moment between two human beings. It was evidence, proof demanded by the dynasty. For the princess, her body was weighed against the expectations of empire. She had to demonstrate purity, loyalty, and worth, all in one night. The stakes were suffocating. A failed consummation could spark whispers of betrayal, dishonor, or infertility. In the cruel arithmetic of politics, a princess who could not fulfill her duty was a liability. The empire did not forgive such liabilities easily. Some women who faltered found themselves discarded, their influence evaporated before it could take root. Others faced harsher fates, their lives ended quietly, their names buried beneath layers of silence. In the Ottoman court, survival was not guaranteed by royal blood. It depended on submission to the will of power. As the night drew closer, anxiety mounted. Every detail was prepared with precision. Servants filled the chamber with perfumes, silks were laid out on the bed, attendants whispered words meant to comfort but that only deepened the weight of expectation. The princess herself was stripped of agency, left to step into a ritual that had been repeated countless times by the women who came before her. Each breath carried the knowledge that failure was not an option. Every heartbeat echoed with dread. Slowly the palace grew quiet. Torches flickered against the walls, their flames unsteady, their light casting long shadows. The silence pressed down like a heavy cloak. In that stillness, the princess was expected to surrender herself to a man she might have never spoken to, a stranger whose face was familiar only in rumors or fleeting glimpses. Sometimes he was a seasoned governor decades older, carrying both political weight and the arrogance of age. Sometimes he was a rival the sultan sought to tame, now bound to the dynasty through his union with her. In either case she was the offering, the prize, the guarantee, the seal of loyalty. And beneath all the ceremony the fear remained. The consummation was not only physical but political. It was a demonstration that the bond was sealed, that the empire had extended its hand and the subject had clasped it in return. Should the union falter on that night, suspicion could spread like wildfire. Was the husband disloyal? Was the princess unworthy? Was the dynasty weakened by hidden flaws? The princess carried all these burdens in her silence, her body turned into the empire's ledger of proof. There were those who endured the ordeal, who learned to wield their positions with quiet strength, navigating their marriages to carve influence in the shadows of power. But many others were not so fortunate. Their first wedding night was the beginning of a slow erasure, a descent into exile within their own lives. Sent far from Istanbul, they lived in distant palaces, bound to men they never chose, condemned to play roles scripted by politics rather than love. They were daughters of the greatest empire of their age, yet prisoners of their own names. The cruelty of it all lies in the absence of choice. These women were born into palaces, raised in silk, trained in refinement, yet stripped of the most basic right, to decide who would share their lives, their beds, their futures. The empire demanded obedience, and the sultan's will was law. Their fear was not an overstatement but a truth etched into their existence. Each wedding night was a trial, one that could determine the course of their lives and sometimes the course of their deaths. If this shocked you, share your thoughts in the comments. History hides more nightmares than fairy tales. For many Ottoman princesses, the wedding night was not an end but a beginning, the start of a life marked by distance, obligation, and uncertainty. Once the ceremonies concluded and the union was sealed, the princess often left behind the familiar walls of Istanbul, never again to live within the heart of the empire. She was dispatched to distant provinces, to reside in the estates or palaces of her new husband. There, she was expected to serve as both wife and silent ambassador, embodying the presence of the dynasty far from the capital. For some, this meant years, even decades, of loveless marriages. Husbands chosen for loyalty did not always extend affection. They saw in the princess not a partner, but a reminder of their own dependency on the throne. Every argument, every child, every decision in the household was colored by the knowledge that she was the sultan's daughter, and thus both a prize and a burden. The princess herself, meanwhile, lived in a gilded solitude. Servants attended to her, wealth surrounded her, but intimacy, freedom, and genuine choice were rare luxuries. Yet not all faded into silence. Some women, denied the freedom to choose their husbands, found other avenues of influence. A number of Ottoman princesses became shrewd political actors, using their positions to shape alliances, fund charitable works, or influence provincial administration. Through correspondence, through subtle counsel, through the weight of their names, they left marks upon the empire's politics that historians are only now beginning to fully trace. Their marriages may have been arranged as bonds of loyalty, but within those bonds some carved space to exercise power of their own. Still, many more faded into obscurity. Their lives were recorded only in fragments. The name of a husband, the birth of a child, the date of their death. Their voices, their struggles, their fears were not preserved in chronicles. To the empire, they were successful so long as they bore heirs and maintained peace in their households. To history they became shadows, remembered not for who they were but for the roles they were forced to play. The legacy of these marriages stretched far beyond the bridal chamber. They were more than personal unions, they were political weapons that shaped the very destiny of the empire. A well-placed marriage could secure the loyalty of a governor who might otherwise have rebelled. A poorly handled one could spark resentment that simmered into open defiance. Through their forced unions, Ottoman princesses became the invisible architects of stability and, at times, the unwilling causes of unrest. Dynasties endured and wars were prevented, or ignited, because of them. The irony is inescapable. These women were among the most privileged in the empire, yet their privilege came at the cost of freedom. Their names carried weight, but their voices were silenced. Their marriages cemented dynasties, but the price was often a life of isolation or fear. In the grand narrative of conquest and empire, they were not generals or viziers, yet their bodies bore the burden of decisions that shaped history. If this hidden history opened your eyes, like, share and subscribe, let's bring these voices back to life. The stories of Ottoman princesses are not confined to gilded palaces or dusty chronicles. They echo into the present because the core truth remains painfully familiar. Women have long been used as pawns in the games of power. In the 16th century, a princess's marriage was sealed to secure an empire. In the 21st, countless young women across the globe are still forced into unions not of their choosing, their futures decided by the needs of families, clans, or political alliances. The names and settings have changed, but the pattern endures. Forced marriages remain a reality in many parts of the world, binding women into contracts that benefit everyone but themselves. The Ottoman princess who entered her bridal chamber trembling with fear is mirrored today in the girl pressured into marriage at 15, the woman told her worth lies in the alliances her body can create, or the victim of a system that treats her autonomy as expendable. Across centuries, the logic is chillingly similar. The woman is not seen as a person with a voice but as a vessel for loyalty, honor, or control. The cost of treating women as tools of empire, or tools of family pride, is incalculable. For the princesses, it meant a lifetime of fear, exile, or silence, despite being born into the most powerful dynasty of their age. For women today, it means stolen youth, denied education, broken dreams, and trauma that echoes for generations. The silks and jewels of Ottoman palaces only disguised the suffering. The modern equivalents may be subtler, but the wound they leave is no less deep. And this truth should unsettle us. History tempts us to dismiss such practices as relics of a distant, less civilized age, yet when stripped of its palatial grandeur, the plight of the Ottoman princess is not so different from the plight of countless women now. Both are reminders that power has too often been measured not by the freedom it gives but by the freedom it takes away. What lessons then do we draw from this? The Ottoman court demonstrates that even the most privileged women in history were not safe from being reduced to pawns. If women at the height of wealth and dynasty could be silenced, how much more vulnerable were the countless others with no rank or protection? And if that dynamic could shape the fate of empires centuries ago, how much does it continue to shape societies today, in ways both obvious and hidden? History forces us to ask, have we really changed or do women still pay the price for men's power? The walls of Topkapi Palace still stand in Istanbul today, weathered by centuries, yet if you listen closely they hold whispers, of daughters who walked into bridal chambers with trembling hearts, of women born into privilege but trapped in golden cages. Their stories remind us that history is not only about kings and conquests. It is also about those who had everything and yet had no choice at all. The Ottomans built an empire on power, strategy, and alliances, but its women carried the hidden cost. Their beauty, their bodies, their very lives became instruments of survival for men who ruled. And in that silence, entire dynasties shifted, wars were fought, and history itself was reshaped. But the Ottomans weren't the only empire where women's bodies were battlefields. Next time, we'll enter the world of medieval queens who turned marriage into a weapon. Unlike the princesses of Istanbul, these women found ways to wield their chains as blades, reshaping kingdoms, toppling rivals, and proving that marriage could be as deadly as war. If you leave without subscribing, these stories vanish again, silenced, like the whispers of princesses behind palace walls.